Hello and welcome to Excavations, where we talk about Bataille's book, The Accursed Share, Volume 1. We are in our third session, where we are in Section 3, The Industrial Society. Why is it called Industrial Society and not Capitalism? I don't know, because we don't actually get into things that are Industrial Society-esque until Soviet industrialization in Section 4. But whatever. We will be talking about the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism and the bourgeois world. And fitting with Bataille's prior methodologies, this is mostly based off of one other book. But this is a book more of us are familiar with, seeing that most people are forced to read Max Weber sometime in their life, if they ever touch sociology.
All right. To be fair, he does have R.H. Tawney in there.
That's true.
Got a second book.
There's two books. But,
Widening the Library.
But it's it's following this trend of a unified theory of everything based off of minimal reading. So it is actually kind of amazing when you go back to the notes and you look up all the references in this book and you're like, oh, the entire notes for this unified theory of everything are 7 pages. 8 pages. But yeah, so just to point it out, we have Tawney, that is R.H. Tawney, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. A good book, I may add. People should read it. Is quoted twice, 3 times. And then the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism is quoted actually a bunch, but normally also in conjunction with Tawney. So 2 books. What do we make of this reading, team of interpreters?
I mean, it does follow pretty closely Weber's argument. Like, he kind of just takes Weber's account of like Calvinist relations, but then he kind of just takes that as evident. And then mostly, like in other chapters, the interesting stuff is kind of his like variation of commentary, trying to relate that to what he thinks like use and consumption means socially.
Yeah, when I read this chapter, which is called The Origins of Capitalism and the Reformation, which I find interesting. Even today in a given region, one sees Protestants being drawn to business and Catholics to more liberal professions, blah, blah, blah. Although I did want to throw Brundell at these people because Brundell is the person who argues that capitalism actually has its origins in the monastic institutes of the 13th century. But that would require Bataille to read a book that I'm not sure was written yet. And in fact, I don't think it was. And also, that would be a 3rd book, and we can't have that. We can have no more than 2 books per chapter. But yeah, I felt like this was a weirdo gloss. I mean, if this is gonna sound like a huge insult, and maybe it is, but I felt like it was a weirdo writing a Wikipedia article about Tawney and Weber, and that was it. Like, which okay, cool. Not particularly useful though. What do you guys think? Like, what did you find interesting in the gloss? Because I'm having trouble like figuring out what to talk about here, where I'm not just repeating 2 books I've read elsewhere. I mean, I do find this section very interesting, the resemblance between the Reformation and Marxism, because that's actually somewhat new, so I might need to read that. Considering the course followed by the reformers and its consequences, it would be paradoxical to conclude, quote, it put an end to the relative stability and equilibrium of a world in which man was less estranged from himself than we are at present. It would be easy to, in fact, find ourselves personally looking for a form of humanity that does not betray it, shunning those vacant lots, those suburbs and factories whose appearance express the nature of industrial societies, and making our way towards some dead city bristling with Gothic spires. We cannot deny that the present-day humanity has lost that secret kept until the current age of giving itself a face in which it might recognize the splendor that is proper to it. Doubtless the works of the Middle Ages, in a sense, were only things. They could rightly appear worthless to anyone who envisioned beyond in its inaccessible purity the wealth that he attributed to God. Yet the medieval representation of society has the power today of evoking that lost intimacy. A church is perhaps a thing. It is little different from a barn, which clearly is a thing. A thing is that we know from without what is given to us a physical reality verging on a utility available without reserve. We can penetrate a thing and it has no meaning other than its material quantities. That's true. Adapted or not to some useful purpose in its productive sense of the word. So things only have use values for Bataille, which I found interesting. But like that's the only part of this that seems really kind of new, and even that's not totally new.
Yeah, that kind of brings up something with the next chapter. Is like he starts talking about like this idea of intimacy that maybe it had popped up in earlier chapters, but I never really saw him giving it like that much importance as a term.
Mm-hmm.
And later when he starts talking about like Marx and stuff, he brings up like the intimacy aspect a little bit more, that there's this kind of like paradox of like it's part of what he's trying to kind of make like a Feuerbachian point, where he's like, the paradox of like religion is that religion gives you like the sacred, and the sacred provides like a sort of intimate experience, but it's necessarily like external. So it's intimate, but it's externalized because religion, you know, sort of clouds you're pretending that something that is intrinsic to man is actually projected into some sort of like external being or whatever. So he kind of starts bringing that up here, and he kind of ties that too with it. He kind of has an interesting variation on like why Luther starts the Reformation, where he kind of ties that to his theory of religion and consumption, where there's always like this kind of paradox of sacrifice or religious kind of waste or right. It's supposed to be something that can't be reduced to utility, but the act of doing sacrifice for some sort of end kind of complicates that, because like you can do all these sacrifices and stuff to have some sort of connection to God and salvation, but you're not supposed to like directly want or you're not supposed to have like a utilitarian end of being like, I'm going to sacrifice this stuff so that God will then save me, because it's like, no, it has to be the grace of God. So you get kind of trapped in this weird paradox of like, you know, or like, I'm going to waste all this stuff to bring rain to the harvest, but I shouldn't. You're not supposed to think of it as a kind of like direct exchange. It has to have this kind of like gift element where you're not supposed to admit that. You're supposed to kind of just be like making an appeal or something. And he kind of says like the reason that Luther's thought takes hold is that he's kind of like, he himself is bothered by this, but his solution is to just say like there is no relationship between like, there's no relationship where like doing good stuff in the material world gives you salvation later on. You know, that's the Calvinist, like, and that becomes the Calvinist like worth ethic, where good works are not tied to salvation. So that's kind of, he kind of has a little bit of an interesting variation on kind of the specifics of Weber's. I mean, he ties it to his notions of this kind of like paradox of consumptive activity in religion. But yeah, that was kind of the only part that I noticed that I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But other than that, it's mostly, yeah, like a gloss to me on,
Yeah.
he's like, medieval economics worked this way, and there wasn't like an autonomous market to them. But then they get this like individualist work ethic kind of.
Yeah, it's, I don't know, the more I read Brundell, the more I'm like, nah, man, that stuff was emergent anyway. Like the idea that it just came from the Reformation. But I mean, there's also, you could also make the argument that the Reformation's already emergent in Western Catholicism too, and then, you know, this can still somehow work. But I found these two chapters. I find these two chapters both fascinating, but like weirdly hard to talk about, because the first one I think is a Grauss-Ontani and Weber, as we mentioned, with a little bit of let's tie this back into the surplus thing. And then the bourgeois world is just basically like Marxism is not that different from the Reformation, which means Marxism is also quasi-bourgeois. That's it. Those are the big points.
Yeah, he has a really weird. He does have. It is interesting to read because he has this weird reading of Marx that's so like. I don't know. You get again. You get the sense that he probably hasn't read that much Marx directly, and it's kind of more of a just commentary on like probably what just kind of like what people saw as Marxism in the sort of like this is what the French Communist Party and the Soviets say, like like that kind of like they want to like mass industrialize society without religion and without these things so that it's all down to like humankind. So he has this really weird reading where he's like, yes, communism embraces the idea of like man as a thing because the working class are like subjected to thinghood, but their aim is to sort of like make all the world of thingness subservient to like the sovereignty of man, but not to like transcend or avoid the thingness and the relationship and order of things. Seems to be like his point. So he kind of thinks it's good because it like reintegrates the sovereignty of man that he wants, but it's a little bit like ambiguous because he sees the communists as too like they're still like integrated. They're kind of like pushing the Calvinist idea of thingness and like utility to the breaking point until it becomes like subservient to like the activity of man in this kind of free way. But it doesn't have any room for this kind of like excessive, glorious waste that he wants, or at least not like consciously. It kind of
he'll argue in the next section that unconsciously it does when he talks about
he does go into the Soviets. But yeah, like he almost like never actually quotes Marx or even a Marxist thinker. He just kind of like claims this.
I was about to say, it's not that it's not that he never, it's not just that he doesn't do it a little bit. I literally checked the references. There's not a single Marx reference in the book.
Yeah, there's a page, this weird page on page 135. He gives like this quote in Marx's words, but he's just quoting himself from like 2 pages earlier.
Right.
Yeah, it's like super bizarre.
He's like pretending that that's Marx speaking, but actually he's doing a double ventriloquist dummy with himself summarizing Marx and then attributing it to Marx. But he is at least smart enough not to like try to cite something for that. Like I looked in the back and I was like, there's no references to Marx in the back at all. Like
it's a strange chapter. It did make me think a little bit of, it's kind of interesting how this precursors like some of the really later stuff that Adorno starts to do, where you get like a critique of use value itself, and the idea that like maybe it's good that like we want to get beyond the exchange value aspect. I mean, we want to focus on the use of things, but like maybe Marxists have gotten too fetishistic of like the use value itself to the point that this instills, like Adorno kind of says, like maybe we are getting too like trapped in this idea that we need to make use of everything and make it like an end for man. And like in Minimal Moralia, that's why he kind of says this thing about like maybe we shouldn't be like focusing on trying to go out into space on this big like taking over the universe thing. Maybe we should just like be content to like look at the beauty of the sky and just like look and wonder at it and not try to like do anything with it. Like kind of it was just kind of interesting that I feel like in a weird way, as much as Adorno probably didn't really like Bataille, like he has this kind of, he's kind of making an earlier like variation of a certain point that like, whether or not it's like accurate to what Marx intended, it does have some weight because it's like, that's kind of what the Communist parties did end up becoming at the time, was this kind of like certain, there was a certain mindset. And he has that cool little like, at the end, he has kind of an interesting chapter where he talks about like membership into the communist parties really is like you become a thing. And that's why the bourgeoisie like look at this and they're like, why are all these workers joining this party when like the work I give them actually is good for them? And in these parties, they're just like turned into these faceless armies of people. He says on 141, like, A militant of this persuasion is easily reduced to a strict subordination. He readily accepts being finally reduced by the work of liberation to the condition of a thing, which is the case, for example, when discipline prescribes two contradictory slogans in succession, which aside, we've all seen communist parties do that. This radical attitude has a strange consequence. It gives to the bourgeois, to the exploitation which the workers want to abolish, the feeling of upholding freedom for mankind, of avoiding the reduction of individuals to things. And yet, what is involved is only an enormous effort whose aim is self-determination. End quote. Like, that part I was kind of like, that's kind of interesting. Like, he does kind of get this paradox of the way the mass party politics worked, where it's like, yeah, like, you kind of have to be a thing in a lot of these, like, assumptions, to the point that a party line can give you two completely contradictory messages, and you're just supposed to be like, yep, okay, like, party's correct.
Yeah, this oddly came up in a debate recently about the Chinese Constitution, where someone pointed to me that the Chinese Constitution actually claims in its 1982 revision that they've already achieved socialism in China. But then you have to reconcile that with the claim that Xi and Hu Jintao makes that we need to build socialist modernizations to achieve socialism first by 2035 and then by 2050. And I'm like, well, lo and behold, I hate to tell you guys, but sometimes these people contradict themselves. like it's just, but it does make it hard to make definitive claims about what one of these states believes, because if you're not a party member, you have to be like, how do I reconcile this constitutional statement with this statement by the head of by the general secretary of the Politburo and the presidency of China saying that we are going to achieve socialism, with a statement saying we did achieve socialism by 1982. I don't know. And I will say, now this is not unique to Marxists, but Marxists do have a history of trying to uphold really contradictory things in ways that made people not trust us, historically speaking. For example, I mean, the obvious examples are all right before when this book is written, when you're dealing with what the Soviet stance is towards popular and united and fronts and whatnot, which seem to change every 5 to 6 years.
Well, wasn't this written in the late 40s? That would have been exactly the PCF's transitionary phase, because they were the first Western party to, although I'm sure they got this instruction from Moscow, but they were the first party to denounce the Popular Front, and they, Jacques Duclos wrote that letter about Browder, basically accusing him of being a revisionist, et cetera, et cetera. So they were on the vanguard of sort of kicking that out. So I think, Bataille is seeing a lot of this, turning these people into automatons with their multiple zigzags from your first hand.
Yeah, can we just admit, when people get mad at postmodernists for messing up communism, what they're actually getting mad at is the French Communist Party not making any fucking sense.
Yeah.
Because seriously, whenever I read this stuff, I'm like, what was usually inevitably someone points to me to some statement by the French Communist Party, and I was like, no wonder this guy went crazy. See Baudrillard, see Bataille, see et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Although, I mean, Bataille's relationship to Marxism is interesting, because when I was reading this chapter in the Bourgeois World, this sounds both like Adorno, but also like Don Clancho, the super reactionary from Carlos Gomez de Villa, Don Clancho, who was always like, Marxism is just the ultimate manifestation of bourgeois thought through the workers themselves. And I was like, oh boy, because this reminds me of both that and the points made by Adorno in Negative Dialectics, which both Marxist-Leninist and Adornians like Martin J. will use to point out that maybe Adorno didn't really die a Marxist, because that critique of use value thing goes pretty deep in the. I mean, it does seem to imply that late Adorno views Marxism as a positivism that they're critiquing too. So,
yeah.
Any other interesting? I mean, guys, we're only 20 minutes in, and we're like,
yeah. I think what's interesting is that it's just kind of hard to tell. Maybe it becomes more obvious in his USSR chapter. Like, it's hard to tell how much he's sort of like embracing what he sees in this aspect of Marxism, and how much he's condemning it. Because he seems to think he kind of seems to be like, yeah, like Marx is right that he wants to like advance the self-consciousness of people and like put man's like self-conscious activity to the forefront, but also like the thing, like, he obviously Bataille just doesn't really want the like reduction of the material world to utility and thingness. And it's kind of hard to tell exactly how much he's in agreement that he's like, yes, if Marx's like view of this is complete and we push it this far, then like the contradiction of thingness like somehow is sublated or broken down. It's not entirely clear. Or if he's just saying like, this is a step forward from Calvinism, but it's just missing this other like element that is still like, you know, it's not entirely clear to me exactly where he's trying to stand on this. Maybe, like I said, maybe it becomes more clear in his like description / critique / soft defense of Soviet industrialization.
Right.
I always got the vibe that it was just like maybe these, you know, the communists should just become a little more spiritual and just, you know, understand what makes humans a little more unique and, you know, do away with the more, what he would probably see it as materialism.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like Bataille would be really into Sorel.
I think he might have some essays about or talking about Sorel in his early years.
Yeah, I think he might. I need to go. I have.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at Visions of Excess.
Yeah, I have Visions of Excess and also the limits. What is it? The limits of usefulness, and I need to start combing through my new Bataille collections to figure out where he talks about this stuff. But yeah, I'll read this because maybe it'll make it clear. Capitalism is, in a sense, an unreserved surrender to things, heedless of the consequences and seeing nothing beyond them. For the common capitals and things, products and production, are not, as for the Puritans, what is becoming and one wants to become. This is interesting because, you know, I've argued with a Platypus Affiliated Society about like their attempt to make a distinction between the bourgeois world and capitalism, which I don't see in Marx, but actually it is here in Bataille. And it's in this section. If things are within it, if it is itself the thing, then this is in some way that Satan inhibits the soul of someone possessed, unbeknownst to him, or that the possessed without knowing it is Satan himself. Such denial, which in Calvinism was the affirmation of God, was an unattainable ideal in a sense. It could only be the act of a strong personalities capable of imposing the values on which they identified, but exceptions always come into play. On the other hand, freedom given to the thing was the common possibility. There is no need to maintain the purest and the poorest spirituality, which alone was rigorous enough in the beginning to counterbalance the subjection of the whole body and an activity to things. But once the principle of servitude was granted, the world of things, the world of modern industry, could develop itself without any further thought of the absent God. The advantage was clear, and the mind's always quick to grasp the real object of allowing intimacy to recede beyond the threshold of consciousness. The reign of things was supported, moreover, by the natural propensity to servitude. Now, that's a claim, natural propensity to servitude, but whatever. It corresponds in the same moment to the pure will to power, to the growth for its own sake, that outwardly contrary to the servile spirit is basically only its complement. In the service of power that is not used, the perfect form of absorption and of resources is found in only genuine nullification, the least slippery renunciation of life. But this attitude is often difficult to distinguish from that of pure Calvinist, although it is the latter's opposite. At least the Calvinist was at the highest point of alertness and tension. The demand of industrial growth having no purpose than growth, on the contrary, is an expression of solemnness. No tension around him, no desire to adapt the world to his standards. These men whose actions resulted in modern industry were not even aware, the idea of not having occurred to them, that such a world might be possible. They were utterly unconcerned about the impotence in the movement that carried them along. They could not be reduced the world to its law. They even used for development of enterprise the various openings that maintained by the continued existence of various modern movements contrary to theirs. In the capitalist world, there is no principal preference given to the production of the means of production. The preference was only to the pure and communist accumulation. The bourgeoisie was unaware of any opposition between the primacy of growth and its contraries, unproductive expenditures of all sorts, institutions, and values that create expenditures. The opposition only concerned and only affected amounts of the expenditure. Bourgeois capitalism was opposed to luxury, but only in a feeble and illogical way. Its avarice and its action did actually reduce luxury, but if one excludes the uncalculated effects, it never departed from laissez-faire. Now, I want to point out, I have no idea what the fuck that has to do with traditional Marxism, but like, it is interesting what he's using this for. And then skip ahead to page, because I could easily read this entire chapter, because this is the first chapter we've had in a while that isn't him glossing someone else's book. This is the remnants of feudalism and religion. The necessity of first eliminating the values of the past must be made clear. However, in the economic system of the Middle Ages, wealth was unevenly distributed between those who manifested the accepted values in the name of which wealth was wasted, and those who furnished the wasted labor. In the work of the fields or in the towns, thus had a servile quality with respect to the values manifested, but so did the worker with respect to the clerics and the nobles. These latter claim not to be things, but the quality of thinghood, Weber protest notwithstanding, focused squarely on the worker. The original situation had a specific consequence. One cannot expect to liberate men by going to the limit of the possibility of things and nonetheless leave free, as capitalism does, those who have no other reason for being other than the negation of work, which is base, in favor of more elevated activities, asserted to be the only ones capable of restoring man to himself. In a sense, the remnants of feudalism and religion, which capitalism overlooks, represents the immutable and unconscious desire to make a thing of the worker. Now, it's interesting here that he attributes that to pre-capitalist relations. The thingification of the worker here isn't the worker as existing as a commodity which can be traded on the market because of their potential profit values and ability to generate surplus. No, it has something to do with thingification and relations in regards to lords and servile natures. Like, that's a pretty different reading of the origins of stuff than Marx.
Well, it's because the aristocrats and the clerics are idle in some
Right.
sense.
I mean, barring the fact that the aristocrats and the clerics are really... The aristocrats are soldiers and the clerics... I don't know. Are they idle?
Well, but he thinks that their activity has some kind of glory to it that the worker
Right.
doesn't get to partake in.
Right.
I think is like how he would...
It does make sense in a medieval worldview, but doesn't so make sense in a capitalist one. And him thus attributing the thingification of the worker to its pre-capitalist origins is kind of pretty different than Marx talking about the commodification of labor power. But he doesn't seem to see that. I mean, like, I'm just saying, he doesn't seem to think that it's different than what Marx is saying. But
yeah, well, because he seems to think, I think that what this makes clear is that he seems to think that, like, the Marxist project in a way is just, he's kind of making the claim of like, well, communists just want everyone to be a worker.
right.
You know, he's saying like the communist criticism of capitalism is that like it frees up things, like there's no sacredness or like whatever. It's just we embrace thingness as like commodification. But it leaves around these idle people that don't fit into the society as these like capitalists and stuff. And that's like, but those people we can't have those people that are not like themselves being things if we're also unleashing the power of things into society. So he seems to think that communism needs to reduce everything to like, everyone needs to become part of the thingness and the order of things. So everyone kind of needs to be a worker.
That is a logical deduction from Marxism, but from a completely different logic.
Yeah.
Because why everyone needs to be a worker in Marx, I mean, in this Hegelian sense, is so that you all produce society and thus have a common stake in the administration of society, and everyone is thus participating in the collective labor, which they are thus less alienated from, because as a participant they also are participating in the right to govern that process, right? That's kind of the logic in the Critique of the Goethe program anyway. But it is true that like communists want to make everyone workers, but the what Bataille isn't drawing as the next step is in making everyone workers, you're actually ending the existence of workers as a class. Like you have an incentive for if everyone has the same skin in the same game, then everyone actually has a reason to participate in the administration of society, and that makes I think that's going to get complicated when we look at Soviet industrialization. Did anyone read the next chapter? Because I think we're pulling teeth out of this one.
I haven't looked into it. I read it a long time ago, but I haven't looked into it closely.
Yeah, me too. I don't feel comfortable going into it right now. It is
interesting that earlier, before that longer section on feudalism and religion and capitalism, he does have a bit where he kind of acknowledges, in a way, like what the point of this is, where he says, like, on page 138, near the bottom, quote, like, within the limits of strictly economic activity, the rigor has a precise object, the dedication of excess resources to the removal of life's difficulties and to the reduction of labor time. This is the only use of wealth that coincides with an adequation of man to things, and it retains the negative character of action, whose goal for man remains the possibility of being entirely at his own disposal. The spirit of rigor tied to the development of the sciences and techniques is well equipped for this fundamental operation, but the use of the comfort and the myriad services of industrial civilization cannot be limited to a small number of privileged persons. Sumptuary use had functions, it manifested values, and it implied the connection between wealth and the responsibility of manifesting those values. But this manifestation resulted from the error that makes us want to grasp, like things, that which is predicated on the negation of things. The spirit of rigor is thus committed to destroying the remnants of that ancient world. The capitalist law leaves it free to develop the material possibilities that it bears within it, but at the same time tolerates privileges that hinder this development. Under these conditions, the rigor quickly leads one to draw from the sciences and techniques the consequences that reduce the chaos of the present world to the rigor of things themselves, which is the rational linking together of all the operations on things. It then has a revolutionary significance that Marx formulated in a sovereign way. And that's kind of like where he goes into, like, Marx sort of like pushes this to a limit and inverts it, where he's like, it's the logic of things themselves for men, basically. Like, that logic of things needs to be, like, put under, like, human sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, it's weird because he kind of does have a, like, view where he's like, yeah, like, all this productivity to some extent is about, like, removing, like, difficulties and, like, reducing labor time, like, opening up this kind of, like, sovereign availability to people. But yeah, like, at the same time, he's also kind of saying, like, communism is the, like, you know, everyone gets in the jumpsuit, grabs a hammer, and, like, he kind of is like, yeah, that's what they want, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot of thing talk.
Yeah, it is it's kind of confusing to me with the focus on things here. I mean, that to say that it's not a Marx would be kind of wrong. I mean, there's a focus on reification in Marx, but it does seem like the logic of reification here is different.
Yeah, he reads like he's doing some sort of other, like, young Hegelian aspect. It's like, well, because his vision of thingness is like way more trans historical. Like it's a very, like he thinks that it's very much a like almost like ontological relationship, like of attitude towards the world than like I mean, he's giving a like historical analysis of it, but he's not really like tying it to like the specificity of like the commodity fetish or something like that.
Right. It seems Furibachian, or maybe even like more close to what Max Stirner was talking about. Than
I mean, I think it's very clear that he's probably got some There's some of his baggage with like Kojève and Nietzsche and Hegel in the background of this, I think.
Yeah, Kojève's Hegel and whatever the fuck French version of Nietzsche we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
Like, because the will to power stuff is also like, that's completely not a Marx. Like,
yeah.
Other observations.
I still think, though, he sees sort of the communist movement as moving, inexorably forward, getting in that last section, right? I mean, again, we've seen that way again in 1949 or whatever, writing like that. But I just found that curious. He thinks that the bourgeoisie is just going to sit there and doesn't know what to do, because he says all they can do is bemoan their situation. So I find that sort of fascinating that he sort of sees, this sort of forward motion, despite talking about how, austere and controlled all these communists are, that he still thinks he's got that inevitability. He's still got it.
I mean, it is interesting that I kind of actually agree with his assessment of the bourgeois, like, whining about things. But I mean, when you look at this today, this just feels like historically weird. In actual fact, the bourgeois cannot really forget the freedom of their world as the freedom of confusion. In the end, they are merely helpless. The immense results of the working class politics, the generalized provisional servitude, that its only sure consequence frightens them, but they can only bemoan the situation. They no longer have a sense of their historical mission. The fact that it is a response to the ascendant movement of communists, they cannot give rise to the least hope. What I find interesting about that is I agree that the bourgeoisie don't seem to have been able to carry any sense of historical mission, but we can't blame that on communism today. Not really. Communism's not beating out the historical bourgeois movements, because even the communist countries sell on the international market now. So,
Yeah. So I mean,
this might be.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. This might seem ridiculous, but I think if you want to call like some of the tech bourgeoisie still think they have a historical mission, and they see themselves in that.
Yeah, God, terrifying. I mean, it led to this paradox that I was talking to. I got in a yelling fight on social media with someone. Imagine that, and they were yelling at me for saying that the tech bros were willing to countenance MMT to establish an oligarchy. Like, the tech bros are all gold bugs, and I was like, yeah, they may be, and that may have been true even in like the aughts, although I'm not totally sure that was true for all of them. But what I can tell you for sure is they did not turn down all the conditions QE created for venture capital to establish monopsony power, did they? Like, and ironically, the left was the people arguing for the monetary policies that allowed that to happen. So, now they're just kicking down the ladder. And I find it interesting, because that would imply that it's both that they're aware of their contradictions and they think they have a historical mission.
Well, maybe if you look at that kind of phenomenon to some extent in relationship to like, if we like look at what like Bataille's been saying, I'm trying to like, can we like kind of backwards reconstruct what his like maybe argument would be about like
if
what's
Bataille
going
was
on.
still around, and what
Yeah,
would he say today?
I'm kind of thinking about like, because in a way it does feel sort of like weirdly, this is obviously this is all like drawing out like pseudo or like unfinished theory. This isn't like, this is all vibes, but like he's kind of talking about this kind of position of like the bourgeoisie are still stuck in this sort of like thing where they're kind of idle, but like they fulfill like kind of like desire for like an idle sovereign position, but they also need to relate to the world as this like structured of like things that are subjugated to like their thingness. Like they can't really make appeals to like religion. They can't make appeals to this kind of like greater world or greater sacred need. And in a way, I think I'm like, well, maybe there's kind of something about how the techno-reactionary stuff, people always say, like, whether or not they actually want like feudal relationships, the kernel of truth is that they often do have this kind of weird like desire for a system that looks a lot like a kind of like feudal lordship aristocratic notion that combines like this desire to like technocratically like turn things into things, like that, to treat the world as things that are like technocratically sorted and managed by their technology and stuff, but they also want to be in control in this kind of sovereign free way that's not reliant on the power of God or something.
I want to point out that the more you talk about this, I'm reminded that the founder of neo-reactionism was a Bataille
He's a Bataille scholar, yeah. It's Nick Land.
So, I mean, it does that does seem interesting now that I think about it, because I'm like, oh, that makes sense. I mean, if you look at Nick Land moves from Bataille to Hans Hermann Hoppe. For those of you who don't know, he's not a techno-neo-feudalism guy. He's a feudalism really is just capitalism guy.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because it has to do with the relationships over NTAism. And I know we live in a moment where everyone's now techno-neo-feudal, and I still point out, well, you still trade food in a commodities market, man. Like,
yeah. I mean, what's almost more accurate to me about the way I'm trying to do this with Bataille is like Bataille is like, well, this isn't really about like these people actually being like feudal lords. It's just like a certain attitude problem, or like it's a way of trying to like manage your control of the world without having the justification of these older systems. Produces this kind of weird, like I could see an explanation of this where like that's this weird trying to like grab back the privileges and the like sacred power of being an aristocrat while managing a world that requires like a very particular view of like material commodity form like governance kind of thing. Like, but yeah, it is interesting. I wasn't even thinking about that, but yeah, like Nick Land sort of just like ignores that Bataille's critique here is that this ultimately leads you to stagnation, and then like tries to make it accelerationist in its own like right.
Yeah. The more I read Bataille, the more I'm just like, God, why did anyone think you can build a viable politics out of this? I mean, like, it's interesting as a thought experiment, but I'm like, okay, so we should encourage a society where we randomly human sacrifice people for the excess, and thingification is good. Maybe I actually am with you, though. It is ambiguous to me whether he thinks if thingification is actually good or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to kind of keep going, and maybe this will become even more obvious in like volumes 2 and 3, where he gets into like what he means by sovereignty at all. Because it does seem like he kind of wants some sort of like sovereign relation in the community of mankind, and he seems to think that that is necessarily opposed to thingness. But he does seem to be like, well, Marx is right that we've unleashed all this like thingness, that like we've opened up the material world, and Marx is right that we kind of need to like push through that like to a certain point. But I guess we kind of are waiting to see like what does he think the like next, like what does he actually kind of think his version of like this like communist society becomes is still a little unclear, because it seems like he would necessarily have to think that the like thingness that he's ascribing to Marxism would have to fall away or be overturned in its own right somehow.
Yeah.
I mean, you can kind of see how someone like Guy Debord, I don't think he ever made that many direct commentaries on Bataille, but I've read that he was influenced by him, which is funny because on the Situationist internet, the Ken Knapp one, they have this essay about how Bataille is secretly a Stalinist. But like, I kind of, I'm like, I could see where there's like a through line between something like that to like Debord in a way, like this kind of inversion of like, actually a communist society should not be about like the management of things. It needs to be this kind of like expenditure of energy and imagination that can't be constrained, like kind of thing. But it leaves a certain ambiguity about like what is the actual like operation of society, like.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
But I will say I also picked up The Limits of the Useful, like his unpublished book that's sort of like his early draft of Accursed Share Volume 1. I found it pretty, it doesn't have as much like direct relationship to what we're talking about today, but it is interesting to read because large portions of it are like just direct quotations that become stuff in Accursed Share. But it's interesting seeing him intentionally like,
His
it's much
stuff
more
on
obvious.
sovereignty in that book is clearer. Like, I read a section on him talking about what sovereignty does, and it's weird, but it's much clearer than what we're getting in there.
Because I mean, and we'll get more into sovereignty and eroticism and stuff in the next volume, but it's weird because Limits of the Useful has a lot more of his like poetic, like asides and things. But in doing that, like you can tell that that's him experimenting with trying to rein back his style, his stylistic tendencies to get to the kind of clarity that he hopes to have in Accursed Share. Like he wants to have a very simplified, like rigorous argument. But some of the poetic asides kind of make it clearer, I think, in that book what his like where he's trying to like put his values, even though it's like maybe not as like it's necessarily poetic. It can't be like expressed in a very like straightforward way, but you get a bigger sense of like what he's kind of trying to like resolve or open up.
Yeah, I think we might get that in volumes 2 and 3 too, because they're not as polished because they weren't published in his lifetime. So, but yeah, I mean, like I read a whole section on sovereignty and like who has sovereignty and the paradoxes of sovereignty and the limits of the useful that was like way clearer than what we're getting in here. But I also agree with you. It was like a poetic rift. Like just also like a poetic rift that was also kind of an imminent critique of Hobbes. You know.
Oh yeah, like, I kind of remember that. Yeah.
Which is nowhere in this book. But it's
I kind of almost felt like Limits of the Useful in some instances, if someone asked me like to read like where they were going to start with like this kind of stuff, I would almost maybe recommend that before Accursed Share Volume 1, or at least this translation of it, like because it covers a lot of the same, like he talks about the Aztecs and he talks about like, and large portions of it are just the same chapters. But I don't know, I kind of was like, you get a bigger sense of what he's talking about, and it's more fun. Like there's a whole section where he's like writing about the stars, and then he starts writing about how he's sorry that he's writing about the stars, but he didn't want to make himself subservient to work, which would require writing the book in its normal way. So that was an aside to like express his sovereign individuality. It's super bizarre. Like,
yeah, I think Bong Rip Bataille is actually more interesting anyway, and weirdly, actually, the problem that I have with this book is that we're often trying to deduce the stakes of his examples from, because sometimes he tells you, but often he doesn't, or he tells you in such a convoluted ass way that you're like, wait, what? Like, because like this chapter on the bourgeois world seems like a wait, what chapter? Like, huh?
Yeah, I think it's mostly just so that he can build up to talking about the Soviet Union and the Marshall Plan to some extent.
Right. Well, he seems like to see these as two some sort of developments of these tendencies of the bourgeois society, like in relation to use, values, and waste, which I think is going to be interesting, because that's when we actually get the stuff that's roughly contemporaneous to his life. But I will also say, the closer we get to contemporary reality with Bataille, the harder it is to figure out what the stakes are.
Yeah.
Which is kind of weird, actually. Like, like, I don't know. His political, ambiguity really kind of shows through here. Like, and man, do I like post-structuralist French theory seems like this, but just less fun. The more I read this, the more
it's like, I think a lot of it is like Bataille is like legitimately trying to salvage some sort of notion of like, like almost like mystical experience in a non-religious world, and he's trying to ground that in a sort of like idea of like social organization. And like he prefigures post-structuralism in some of this, and he's got like all this stuff about the limits of the rational and literary criticism and stuff. But I think what's interesting about him is that he fundamentally seems to think that this needs some sort of understanding of like the organization of society, and a lot of post-structuralism kind of drops that, except for like maybe Deleuze and
maybe late Foucault.
Yeah, but like it's that like part of what I know I've mentioned this before, but I think like part of what I think makes someone like Bataille and Blanchot and these kind of early post-structuralist weirdos like more interesting to me is that they've got a certain kind of like almost like skin in the game anguish about society that you kind of don't get with a lot of the other post-structuralists. Like, even though these are like reclusive weirdos who are writing essays and just talking about literature and hanging out with their friends at their cafes, like you get a sense like these are people who have been like traumatized by like 2 world wars and just the nature of like mass politics and the world, and like they have some sort of like real desire in their texts to like get at the heart of something that it's not clear, but there's a certain kind of like anguished passion there that feels very different and is a little more intriguing to me than these kind of later persons.
Than professors who got burnt by the Communist Party of France and who like just professor about it all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, because
that
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it still goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's like these people still had this sense of this history marching in a certain direction, and perhaps some sort of idea of progress. And I think that different people at that time would say what they would consider progress, but I think that's not there in the later post-structuralists once you start getting into the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I do think I think that's an interesting observation, that the stakes do feel a lot more real in Bataille than they do in like, I don't know, Lyotard or
like even Derrida's like most explicitly political book on For Marx. It has a certain kind of like, we'll hope that something like the UN for the whole world will like kind of just figure stuff out, like, like some kind of open-ended human rights thing, like,
right.
Like,
you get that, and you get that also in a more explicitly post-Marxist form, and like late Negri and
and like Chantal Mouffe and stuff. Yeah, like
which now we all have turned on and hate, but was all the rage in the late 1990s.
No.
But yeah, I was thinking about Spectres of Marx the other day, and about how like, oh yeah, we're it's a book about Marxism that's about how the UN needs to be more compassionate and global.
There is New International or whatever, like this vague like. But I mean, the like Chantal Mouffe is what I was thinking of when in the Discord, where there was kind of like, the debate about like to what extent we should be like actively critiquing wokeness or identity politics. And I wasn't even really trying to comment on that specifically, but I had a comment where I was saying how I remember like my big deal when I encountered like these kind of like campus activist types was that, there's this kind of Chantal Mouffe, like, we can't really actively do anything yet because everyone's too different and everyone has different ideals and identities and stuff that are all going to like stomp on each other's toes. But we can kind of like engage in this nebulous discussion that will eventually like reach this kind of like absolute subaltern demand. But we can't say what it is because we haven't figured out what all the like disparate identities like fighting over things are yet. And my point was, I was like, there's a really weird sense to me of like, it's kind of an inversion of the kind of populist workerist Marxist argument of like, if we all just like come together under like the problem of being a worker, then eventually all these other like problems like will get sorted out because like this one thing will deal with it. And I'm like, it's the exact same thing, but they're just saying it's a big question mark what the unifying like the actual thing that brings everyone together just never gets resolved in any actual way. And like that's like, to me, what that kind of like post-structuralism is frustrating, because I can understand like, we can't claim to always resolve everything already. Like it's good to have that kind of bataille. Like there's always like a heterogeneity. There's always going to be stuff that's not easily resolvable in this like immediate concrete sense because of your Marxist theory or whatever. But you also kind of can't just like put it off into this rolling teleology that you have no actual like stance on where it goes, Anyway.
Yeah.
Post-structuralism rant over.
The way you put that when you say that you can't formulate what we're going to do next, but we're going to come together in some sort of like campus debate group, that just gives me Bernsteinian, like the movement is everything, the aim is nothing still. Like a
I don't know. I was just thinking like in hindsight, I'm like, there's a really weird sense that it's really not that different than the worst criticisms of how a lot of goal-oriented, hyper-Marxist, obnoxious, like Trotskyist cells or whatever work in practice. Like it kind of it has this weird negative universe vibe. Like it's just, like, I don't know. It's weird to figure out how, like, what do you do in terms of trying to like accommodate a wide range of like being, open-ended and like not immediately squash demands and needs and stuff that are not already like in your mind's eye of this is what the type of revolution or revolutionary will be. Like, I don't know how you do that, but also like, you also can't just be like, well, the movement will just carry us forward because we all want something that we can't say what. Like, kind of get trapped in the problem. It's like the problem I have with like the quote unquote open Marxist movement to some extent too. Like, I appreciate their attempt to kind of be like, these things are unresolved, but it kind of still feels like there's this tension of like, on the one hand, they just kind of want to go back to Marxology. On the other hand, it kind of feels like it's just a weird nebulous project that's not really putting forward what they actually want. Like,
well,
other than like the Zapatistas are good.
I haven't heard anyone like quote John Holloway in ages, so.
Yeah, no. Every time I read John Holloway on open Marxism, I'm like, oh, this starts interesting and ends stupid.
Or you're reading Werner Bonefeld, where you're like, I can't figure out what this man is saying,
Right. Yeah.
It's a bunch of riddles about fetishization where I is anything non-fetishistic? I don't know anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, Warner Bonefield seems to be like, if you took Adorno's perplexing tendencies and just distilled them down into another person. But it is interesting that open Marxism basically, I mean, what did it give us ultimately? Not a whole lot.
I mean, like, there's like figures that I like that contributed to those like collections and debates, but like, yeah, it kind of feels like a lot of the best people that were sympathetic to open Marxism were people that became like the smart communizers.
Define smart communizer while I go do something.
Well, I just mean like the communizers that have some like grasp of like political economy to some extent, like, the like post-analytic communizers.
Well, I don't know. Does Harry Cleaver count as an open Marxist?
Harry Cleaver, yeah, like the autonomous guy. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think he's like been in discussion with them. He's probably friends with John Holloway.
Yeah, definitely.
They work.
Yeah, because they're both in the Zapatista stuff. But I do like Cleaver.
I like Cleaver quite a bit too. I have issues with his some of the way that I actually really like his book on how to read Capital, but I also have some issues about like he still kind of slips into this thing where he's like more rigorous about like trying to figure out what counts as like a value relationship and stuff, but then sometimes he still does the like students are creating value when they go to class and stuff that you're a bit like it feels like he's trying to be more rigorous, but then he kind of also just wants to use, he can't escape the fact that his post like autonomy like view necessitates calling certain things a value relationship or tied to value to justify like revolution, or like to justify like the subjectivity of the students can be revolutionary because they're tied to value relationships. Like he needs to make that chain like backwards, so it kind of sometimes feels like he's like self-justifying certain things in a way. But I also find he's got a strong sense of how do you do fellow kids in his books, like where he's like trying to explain like the value form, and he starts talking about like Wu-Tang Clan's cream stuff, and I'm like, dude, you're like 70. Like what are you doing? I like Cleaver though, he's a cool guy. But it's an interesting Facebook follow.
Yeah.
He still has the anonymous the V for Vendetta mask as his profile picture. I'm like, wow, that dates you, man. Like,
yeah, I was about to say that's like 20 years ago.
It's like still giving off some like pseudo Occupy vibes.
Yeah, wow. Well, I mean, it is interesting where Marxism has gone, which is basically into the abyss. But oh, excuse me. I'm letting my existential angst show. But
but when you're looking at an abyss, Bataille looks back at you, so that's why it leads you back to this.
So are you telling me that a lot of these Marxists are just going to be tech bro worshipping neo-reactionaries by 2 or 3 years? Because I feel like we're already there in some ways.
Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe I think that's one of the reasons Bataille is interesting. Like, if you're someone interested in a kind of like Marxist project and you're a bit kind of nihilist, like he's kind of like the early, like he's less politicized, but he has a certain vibe that kind of appeals to that like early, like nihil calm, like well, like what does this guy have to say? Like he seems.
Do we need to go where the Monsieurs DuPont actually ended up though? Because one of them's a reactionary, and the other one's the most obnoxious liberal I've ever dealt with in my life.
Yeah, but I'm saying that's why I like reading Bataille over them. It's like if you're going to be like feeling nihilistic, I think Bataille's like there's worse things that you could read. Like, if you're interested in Marxism and feeling bad, like, Bataille's pretty good for that.
I don't know. If you want to feel bad, though, you can just go classic Frankfurt School or Guy Debord or Twitter. Or excuse me, X. I mean, you know, you can read about how the biggest threat to society is the PMC while they're in clear free fall at the moment, but no one's really talking about that.
Yeah, but I think it's Bataille has that kind of phenomenological aspect where like it's him kind of just working out his feelings,
in
a certain way, and that's kind of like refreshing. I mean, like you can get like Minimum Moralia or whatever, but I feel like Bataille's got that sort of like, I don't know. It's like reading. It's sort of like there's a reason he's sort of the Marxian Nietzsche in a way. Like it has that sort of like he's just working shit out in a weird some of it's kind of psychological, some of it's societal meld. And I think everyone can. I think when you feel like you're at a dead end, trying to like do politics or analyze society, that can be kind of refreshing to watch someone just kind of be like, I'm feeling frustrated, and here's all my feelings and all my thoughts about society, and I'm trying to work through both of those at the same time. It's kind of nice to read someone else try and do that to some extent.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to me. I mean, to get back into this a little bit, Bataille was Bataille. I don't think Bataille was an academic, really. I mean, he was an intellectual, but I don't think he was like a.
I mean, he trained in numismatics, but he mostly was a teacher, I think.
Yeah, he was a teacher and like a
primary school teacher,
and like an erotic novel writer. He wasn't really like a. I mean, it is like you see the same shift that you see with communist theory, where it's like sincere people, some of whom are in politics, some of whom are revolutionaries, but who are writing in a literary production milieu that's largely not academic. And then by the 1950s, they're all academics.
Yeah,
like Bataille's in that transitions period. So
didn't he work at? Did he work at the French library? Because there's that whole thing about Walter Benjamin gave him the arcades projects, and like he was the one that hid it like in the library archives for him before his like attempt to escape and thing. And I think he also like Kojève like gave him like his letter to like Stalin or something. Like also gave him a weird like everyone was just giving Bataille shit to hold on to for some reason.
Well, it's also interesting when you like read about like I think you and I were talking about that, like Simon Veil being like this guy's a weirdo. Why do we hang out with him? Like, but he does. And
he was also like his circles are insane.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, Lacan stole his wife. What else? I mean, like he just seemed to somehow fumble into being the weird mystic weirdo that everyone ignored, but somehow everybody knew in France. So. And
like he ran a magazine with is it John like Whale, like who was like the main like French Kantian like analytic philosopher at the time. And it's like what could these two people have possibly had in common? Like you know, like why are you running a magazine together?
I mean it is also weird for me to think about like the influence he had on Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, and Foucault too, because it's there, but it's also bizarre, and it does seem that I guess I need to like figure out this French ambivalence about Marxism that we see in this time period, because it's not just in Bataille, where people like both feel that Marxism is inevitable, but they don't know if they're happy or sad about it. Like that is interesting, because it's so different from even the 70s.
Yeah, I was thinking in a similar vein. I was thinking about comparing Bataille to Robert Musil, the Austrian novelist, who they have a weird similarity because like You know, both of them are like big sort of like diarist, essayist, artistic people. Musil also has a very strong interest in trying to like bring back a like non-religious form of like mystical experience. Like he seems to think that's like a valuable thing that like we need to like bring back, like a non-religious, like materialist form kind of a mysticism. But like Musil is also very like into like he wants like some kind of socialist society that embraces like the individual, and so he's kind of distrustful of Marxism because he's looking at 20th century Marxism and he thinks it's too like kind of collectivist. But the difference is that Musil wants to also like bring back, like he's defensive of rationality in a way that Bataille isn't, even though Musil thinks that there's a like dialectical relationship between rational thought and what he calls the non-ratioid thought, that he thinks that we need to learn to like apply rigorous, like we should have some sort of like rigorous way of talking about non-rationalist things, even though we can't apply rationalist thought to them. Like they're very, they struck me as being two like very interesting, like very different but kind of the same people that you could like compare, that go in like different directions with the same concerns in a way. But I think it just shows that there's a certain kind of like intellectual thing going on where there's this sense of people that are like, they kind of want a form of socialism, they're against capitalism, they're mostly against the right, maybe Bataille's kind of ambivalent about that, but they have this kind of uncertainty about what Marxism is at the time in the communist movement, and a lot of it seems tied to this almost phenomenological, like kind of like spiritualist concern about like what does it mean to like be an individual in the world and your relationship like to the world. That's what kind of tears them out of the like communist movement in a way. I mean, in a way, Simone Weil is also kind of in there. Like, she's explicitly religious, but, you know, like that kind of, there's an individualist, spiritual radicalism going on.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we've exhausted this chapter. Does anyone have a final note to say other than Bataille's a weirdo?
No, he's a weirdo. That's the major takeaway.
Wikipedia entry.
All right, TLDR, Bataille's a weirdo. All right, and on that note, we shall end.